dream destinations, exceptional cruises, polar adventures. Welcome to Beyond the Horizon, the podcast that takes you where the journey truly begins, a production of Area Voyages.
Imagine walking into a museum, right? You want to admire this delicate, just totally priceless 13th century painting.
Oh, absolutely. You're expecting a quiet, contemplative moment.
Exactly. But instead, you find yourself caught in a literal stampede. I mean, we're talking 10,000 people. You're getting elbowed, you're sweating, struggling to breathe in this really stagnant air.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare.
It is. And suddenly you realize you have absolutely no chance of actually studying the brushstrokes on this painting.
You're just trying to survive the room at that point.
Right. And the thing is, that physical crush, that's not some hypothetical scenario. That is the daily, visceral reality of visiting Dubrovnik in the peak of July.
Oh, man. Yeah, it's intense.
You arrive expecting this transcendent connection with a perfectly intact medieval masterpiece, and instead you find yourself locked in a very modern battle with just, well, the sheer physics of megatourism.
It's true. I mean, it forces us to ask a really structural question about modern travel, you know?
Like what?
Well, how do you navigate a city that was architecturally engineered over centuries to keep invading armadas out, but is now, you know, fundamentally incapable of keeping modern visitors away?
Wow, yeah. The defenses became a trap.
Exactly. The defensive mechanisms of the past have actually become the bottleneck traps of the present.
And that structural paradox, that's exactly the mystery we are unpacking in today's deep dive. We are drawing from a really phenomenal foundation of source material today.
Yeah, it's a fantastic guide.
It's called the Ultimate Dubrovnik Travel Guide, put together by a travel advisor and cruise specialist named Yvonne Jr. Blanchette from Area Voyages.
And reading through his analysis, I mean, it becomes immediately clear that this isn't just a list of photogenic viewpoints.
Oh, not at all. It reads like a survival manual.
It really does. It operates much more like a strategic playbook. And our mission today is to arm you with that ultimate playbook for the Adriatic.
Right. We're looking way past the superficial postcard stuff to decode the underlying mechanisms of the city itself.
We're going to analyze the intensely specific geography of the coast and break down this staggering seasonality that basically dictates every single movement you make within those walls.
And we'll unpack a history of the Republic of Ragusa that, honestly, it makes fantasy novels look tame.
Oh, totally.
Yep.
It's wild. And ultimately, we'll outline how to leverage this ancient walled fortress as your launch pad for exploring the wider Balkans.
But, I mean, to successfully execute that playbook, we really have to start by confronting the sheer scale of the logistical obstacles you face if you arrive unprepared.
Right, because the margin for error here is incredibly slim.
Super slim. Which brings us to what the author treats as the single most critical piece of intelligence in the entire guide.
This seasonality, the uncompromising reality of Adriatic's seasonality.
It is the golden rule. The numbers laid out in the guide for the summer months, they represent an absolute siege. I mean, in July and August, Dubrovnik's port receives a daily rotation of modern megaships.
Floating skyscrapers, basically.
Yeah, floating skyscrapers that simultaneously funnel between 8,000 and 10,000 day visitors directly into the historical center.
8 to 10,000.
Every single day of the peak season.
It's just staggering, and you have to map those numbers onto the actual physical space to understand the severity of the bottleneck.
It is not a big space.
Not at all. The entire old town, which is entirely encircled by its medieval fortifications, is an incredibly compact UNESCO World Heritage Site. I mean, you can walk the entire diameter from the western gate to the eastern harbor in about 15 minutes.
15 minutes, that's it.
That's it. The urban planning is entirely 13th century. The streets are narrow, the alleys are steep, and the flow of movement is inherently restricted.
So you are effectively trying to force the population of a small modern town into a highly restricted medieval footprint. The physical layout of the city acts almost like a funnel.
Right. Everyone disembarks the ships, everyone marches toward the pile gate at the western edge, and everyone attempts to walk down the Strada, that's the main central street, at the exact same time.
It's a spectacular failure of spatial geometry. And, I mean, that's before we even introduce the thermodynamics of the city into the equation.
Oh, the heat. The environmental factors severely compound the spatial crowding.
It's brutal.
The guide is emphatic about the high summer climate. Temperatures in July and August routinely hover well over 35 degrees Celsius.
So like over 95 Fahrenheit.
Easily. And you are walking into an environment constructed entirely of pale, polished limestone.
It's literally an architectural heaven. I mean, the limestone streets have been worn completely smooth by centuries of foot traffic to the point where they are highly reflective.
Right, so you aren't just absorbing the direct solar radiation from above. The ground is essentially bouncing that intense UV light and heat directly back up at you.
Like walking on a mirror. And the massive stone walls and these densely packed buildings trap the stagnant air. They completely block the coastal breeze.
The author states unequivocally that the old town during those peak midday hours is genuinely hostile to human comfort. It's just unbearable.
Recognizing that hostility, the guide transitions from a warning into strict tactical advice. It's very direct.
Yeah, if your schedule forces you into a July or August visit, maybe because of school calendars or rigid cruise itineraries, there is a very specific, non-negotiable summer survival strategy you must employ.
You have to treat your daily itinerary with almost military precision.
Exactly. The first phase is what we can call the dawn offensive. You have to strike early.
Right. If you're going to explore the open-air elements of the city, particularly the high walls, you must be there the moment the turnstiles unlock.
Depending on the month, that means being at the gates at 7 or 8 a.m. sharp. You secure your access before the sun clears the surrounding mountains.
And crucially, before the armada of tour buses and cruise tenders begins offloading at the western gate.
Right. Once you've secured that early morning window, the strategy shifts to phase 2, which is the absolute retreat.
The retreat. I love how he phrases this. From 10 a.m. until roughly 5 p.m., the author advises abandoning the exposed streets of the old town entirely.
Just get out of there. You do not attempt to push through the crowds on the Stradun, and you certainly do not attempt any strenuous sightseeing.
You essentially cede the territory to the crowds. You fall back to heavily shaded courtyards, or maybe explore the thick-walled, climate-controlled interiors like the Rector's Palace or the Maritime Museum.
Or, even more effectively, you break out of the immediate vicinity completely. You retreat to the coastal pine forests of the La Pad Peninsula, take a water taxi out to the islands, or just disappear into a deeply shaded local canoba for a prolonged 2-hour lunch.
You just completely remove yourself from the friction of the crowd.
Yeah, and that retreat preserves your energy for the final phase, which the guide frames as the reclamation.
Reclaiming the city.
Exactly. After 6 p.m., the rigid logistics of the cruise industry actually start working in your favor.
Because they have to leave.
Right. The massive ships face strict departure schedules, meaning those thousands of day trippers are forced back to the port. The regional tour buses head north up the coast.
And the environment shifts.
Yeah.
The sun drops behind Mount Sro, the ambient temperature plummets, the shadows lengthen, and that intense glare on the limestone finally softens.
The city undergoes this massive physiological shift. It magically empties out and breathes again. It's
an atmospheric reset. The evening is when Dubrovnik reverts back to the people who are actually holding ground, staying overnight within or just outside the walls.
But, while this tactical retreat method works for surviving the summer, the author reveals the ultimate strategic advantage for those who have total flexibility in their planning.
Yes, the absolute optimal window, September.
September is the golden key.
The guide treats September as the absolute sweet spot for the Adriatic. And digging into the environmental science of the region, the logic is flawless.
It really is. By the second week of September, the European academic holidays have ended, instantly slashing the sheer volume of that midsummer demographic.
So you immediately regain the physical space to move. But the crucial variable, the real secret here, is the ocean's thermal lag.
Oh, this is the most vital characteristic of the Mediterranean autumn. Throughout the relentless heat of June, July, and August, the Adriatic Sea operates like a massive thermal battery, absorbing and storing solar energy.
Right. So by September, the ambient air temperature drops to a highly comfortable, manageable level, but the water retains all that accumulated summer heat.
You get the perfect inversion. You aren't sweating through your clothes while walking the architecture, but you can still dive into impossibly warm, crystal clear water.
It's the best of both worlds. Furthermore, the angle of the sun shifts in the autumn. The guide beautifully highlights how the light interacting with that polished limestone changes from a blinding high-contrast glare into a softer, warmer, golden diffusion.
The author also notes a profound psychological shift in the city during this window. In the peak of July, Dubrovnik can feel like a performed tourist trap, There's a stunning backdrop entirely consumed by the mechanics of processing visitors.
Yeah, like a theme park.
Right. But in September and rolling into October, it stops feeling like a high-stress theme park and returns to a genuinely inhabited state. The local rhythms of the city reemerge.
For travelers restricted to other windows, the guide does heavily praise the spring months, April through June.
But with a caveat, right?
Yeah, the caveat is that the thermal battery of the sea hasn't charged yet. The water is bracing, if not completely inaccessible for swimming, but the hillsides are brilliant with spring flora, and the crowds are highly manageable.
And then there's winter, stretching from November to March, which is presented as an entirely different, almost moody proposition.
Winter requires a specific type of traveler. Many of the hospitality sectors entirely shut down to recover. The skies can be heavy, rain is frequent.
But the author refers to the melancholy beauty of this season. The ability to walk the Stradun completely alone, shrouded in sea mist, with the dark waves battering the outer fortifications. It offers a level of raw atmosphere that summer visitors just cannot even conceptualize.
Analyzing this dynamic of the performed tourist trap versus the authentic, quiet city raises an interesting historical contradiction.
How so?
Well, we naturally desire these pristine medieval streets to be empty and contemplative. We want the quiet museum experience. But if we look at the reality of Dubrovnik, or the Republic of Ragusa, as it functioned for half a millennium, it was an absolute juggernaut of international commerce.
It was the maritime Wall Street of the Adriatic.
Exactly. It was intrinsically chaotic, noisy, heavily populated and overflowing with foreign merchants, sailors, and global trade. So, in a strange way, isn't a densely crowded, chaotic port exactly what this city was always engineered to be?
You are identifying a brilliant historical irony, and you are entirely correct about the fundamental nature of Ragusa. It was never designed to be a quiet, contemplative space.
It was a fiercely competitive mercantile hub.
Right. But to understand why the modern iteration of this crowding feels so destructive, we have to look closely at the physical mechanics of the infrastructure versus the mechanisms of modern travel. The issue isn't that the city is averse to crowds.
Right.
The issue is the sheer speed and concentration of the modern influx.
It's the physics of the delivery system.
Precisely. During Ragusa's golden age, the harbor was constantly full, but the vessels were wooden merchant galleys. They arrived organically, dictated by prevailing winds and complex trade routes.
So a ship might bring a cargo of spices, textiles, and a crew of maybe 50 men arriving after weeks at sea.
Yeah, and the absorption of those people and goods into the city's economy was continuous but gradual. The urban infrastructure was perfectly calibrated for that steady organic flow.
Contrast that with the modern delivery system. We are talking about 50 sailors arriving on a varying wind. We are talking about a highly synchronized, fossil fuel-driven logistics chain.
That just drops a floating superstructure into the deep water harbor on a rigid schedule.
You have 5,000 people, all disembarking simultaneously, all driven by the exact same 4-hour port stop itinerary, all attempting to occupy the exact same 300-meter stretch of the Stradun before noon.
The medieval infrastructure simply cannot process that concentrated geometry. The defensive choke points of the gates, which were brilliant architectural solutions for confusing and slowing down an invading army, naturally create dangerous, immovable bottlenecks for thousands of rushing tourists.
It's like trying to force the entire volume of a reservoir through a garden hose in 60 seconds. The system completely pressurizes.
It really does.
And understanding that intense spatial pressure and the absolute necessity of timing your movements to avoid it leads us directly to the physical boundary that defines the entire city.
Walls.
Exactly. It's an architectural experience that perfectly encapsulates everything we've just analyzed. Something that offers absolute transcendence at dawn and absolute misery at midday. The medieval city walls.
You simply cannot engage with Dubrovnik without engaging with its walls. They dictate the footprint, the history, and the modern experience of the city. The guide rightfully elevates this as one of the finest, most vital urban walks on the European continent.
The sheer scale of the engineering is staggering. You are embarking on a continuous, unbroken circuit of 1,940 meters.
Just under 2 kilometers of massive, fortified limestone that entirely wraps the historical center.
And the topography it navigates is incredibly dramatic. And on the southern seaward flank, the walls merge directly into the natural limestone cliffs.
Yeah, you are walking along fortifications that rise 25 meters over 80 feet vertically from the surf. On your right, you have an unobstructed, sweeping panorama of the impossibly deep blue Adriatic, with the dark forested mass of Lokrum Island sitting just offshore.
And on your left, the perspective flips inward. You are looking down into the incredibly dense, complex internal geometry of the Old Town.
It's a sprawling sea of terracotta rooftops, punctuated by the Baroque domes of the churches, hidden internal courtyards, and the deep, shadowy chasms of the narrow streets below.
It is visually overwhelming in the best possible way, but this is also where the guide introduces a massive dose of modern reality.
Ah, the sticker shock.
The financial barrier to entry, yeah. The pricing strategy is aggressive. During the high season, securing access to walk this circuit requires a €40 ticket,
which is approaching $50 just for the right to walk in a circle. It immediately forces the traveler to evaluate the sheer value proposition. Is any pedestrian walkway, regardless of its historical pedigree, objectively worth that kind of capital output?
Right, and the author attacks the skepticism head-on, arguing an emphatic yes, but it requires the traveler to understand exactly what that ticket represents.
The immediate tangible value is that it functions as a combination pass. It grants you access not just to the main circuit, but also to Fort Loverjanek, the massive standalone defensive citadel positioned on a rocky outcrop just outside the western perimeter.
Which we will definitely analyze heavily when we get to the city's pop culture footprint.
For sure, but the deeper value is rooted in the economics of overtourism we just discussed.
We have to view that €40 price point as a critical capacity management tool.
Exactly. When a city possesses an asset this famous and is besieged by the volume of visitors Dubrovnik sees, pricing elasticity becomes one of the only viable levers for physical crowd control.
If access to the walls were free, or nominally priced at €5, the physical infrastructure would be dangerously compromised by the sheer weight and crush of bodies.
The aggressive price naturally filters the demand, ensuring that the environment on the walls remains relatively safe and navigable.
It's a fiscal defense mechanism. Furthermore, the revenue isn't just disappearing into a void. You are actively walking on one of the most immaculately preserved, heavily battered pieces of 13th century UNESCO World Heritage infrastructure on the planet.
The constant friction of millions of footsteps, combined with the relentless corrosive battering of the salty Adriatic winter storms, requires astronomical continuous funding for structural maintenance and preservation.
So the guide insists the experience absolutely justifies the premium, but hinges entirely, once again, on the golden rule of the Adriatic, the timing.
Yes. If you pay €40 to access that exposed stone circuit at 1 p.m. in the middle of August, it will feel like an extortionate punishment.
You will be completely exposed to the blistering solar radiation, locked into a slow, shuffling procession behind massive tour groups, entirely unable to pause or absorb the environment without stalling a line of frustrated people behind you.
But if you apply the tactical dawn offensive?
Right, if you are at the gate at 8 a.m., the thermodynamics are entirely in your favor.
The stone is cooled overnight. The massive cruise tenders haven't crossed the harbor yet.
The morning light strikes the terracotta roofs at a low, brilliant angle. You actually possess the physical space to stop, lean against the ancient parapets, feel the sea breeze, and comprehend the monumental history beneath your feet.
At that point, the financial cost just evaporates against the quality of the experience. It's totally worth it.
Walking the walls provides the ultimate understanding of the city's internal skeleton, showing you exactly how the streets fit within the fortifications. But the guide is excellent at suggesting alternative methods for mapping the city's geometry, too.
Right, because to truly comprehend why Dubrovnik was considered an impregnable fortress, you have to drastically alter your elevation.
One of the primary method for that is the Mount Strad cable car.
Mount Strad is the sheer, craggy, formidable limestone ridge that abruptly dominates the skyline immediately to the north of the city.
The topography is severe. The cable car system operates from a lower station just outside the northern walls, rocketing you up a remarkably steep incline to the summit.
An elevation of 405 meters, roughly 1,300 feet, in under 4 minutes.
You transition from sea level to the peak of a mountain in the time it takes to listen to a pop song.
The guide highlights the observation deck at the summit as arguably possessing the single greatest panoramic viewpoint in the entire region. From that elevation, the abstract layout of the city instantly snaps into perfect clarity.
You can trace the exact 1,940-meter circuit you just walked. You see how the city juts out into the sea, heavily fortified against naval bombardment, yet fiercely backed against the mountain.
And looking north, the horizon opens up to reveal the entire Elafidi archipelago stretching up the Dalmatian coast.
But the summit of Mount Shrod is not just a scenic overlook. It is the site of a profound, incredibly sobering modern historical reality.
The upper station complex houses the Homeland War Museum.
Right, which meticulously documents the brutal 1991 to 1992 siege of Dubrovnik.
This is such a critical layer of context. When you walk through the pristine, shining streets of the old town today, the preservation is so absolute that it feels like the city has simply slept peacefully for 500 years.
You are entirely insulated from the fact that just over 30 years ago, during the violent disintegration of Yugoslavia, the Yugoslav People's Army occupied the heights of Mount Sra and subjected this UNESCO-protected city to a devastating, prolonged artillery bombardment.
The geographical reality of the city backed against a steep mountain made it highly vulnerable to modern siege tactics.
The museum details the international outcry, the heroism of the local defenders, and the staggering scale of the destruction. When you look down at that sea of terracotta roofs today, what you are actually seeing is a monumental effort of reconstruction.
Yeah, a vast majority of those roofs had to be painstakingly rebuilt in the 1990s, using traditional firing methods and clay sourced from specific regional quarries to perfectly match the historical aesthetic.
It fundamentally shifts your relationship with the architecture. It proves that the beauty of Dubrovnik isn't just an accident of history. It is the result of immense trauma and staggering modern resilience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have the perspective from inside the walls and the macro perspective from the mountain above. The guide then recommends a third, highly dynamic way to interact with the city's defenses.
Dropping all the way down to a waterline.
Yes. The author strongly advocates for the guided sea kayaking expeditions that launch from Pyle Harbor directly beneath the western fortifications.
Oh, that sounds amazing. When you are sitting in a small kayak at sea level, bobbing in the swells of the Adriatic, you are forced to crane your neck to look 80 feet straight up, a sheer vertical wall of impenetrable stone. I mean, the theoretical concept of an impregnable fortress becomes incredibly real.
It connects you directly to the maritime anxiety of the past. You instantly realize how utterly intimidating, how physically demoralizing this city must have appeared to the captain of a Venetian or Ottoman war galley tasked with attempting to breach it.
And the guide specifically recommends timing this aquatic excursion for the late afternoon or early evening.
Paddling along the southern perimeter as the sun begins to set, the harsh glare softening, the water turning an inky blue. It offers a profoundly different emotional resonance than battling the midday crowds on the Stradun.
You are interacting with the city on its original elemental terms, stone and sea.
And as you navigate that western perimeter, whether on the walls or from the water below, your attention is inevitably drawn to the massive, detached fortress guarding the harbor approach.
Fort Louvriegenac.
Exactly. Which introduces a complex, modern layer to the city's identity. Because millions of people around the globe who possess absolutely no knowledge of Croatian geography or medieval history, they already know every staircase, courtyard, and parapet of that specific fortress.
Right. We have to address the massive, fire-breathing dragon in the room, the absolute pop culture behemoth that is Game of Thrones.
Starting in its second season, the production selected Dubrovnik to serve as the primary filming location for King's Landing, the capital city of Westeros. The subsequent impact on the local tourism economy was nothing short of explosive.
The guide meticulously catalogs the key filming sites that have become pilgrimage destinations. Fort Louvriegenac, isolated on its rocky promontory, was heavily utilized as the Red Keep.
The absolute center of power in the show.
Yeah. Pyle Harbor, where those kayak tours operate, served as Blackwater Bay. The towering Midgedetta Tower on the northwest corner was transformed into the House of the Undying.
And perhaps most notoriously, the sweeping, elegant Baroque architecture of the Jesuit steps in the heart of the old town provided the setting for Cersei Lannister's infamous Walk of Shame.
Which forces a very real, very uncomfortable question about heritage and authenticity. I mean, we are dissecting a profoundly historic, UNESCO-certified city-state that successfully navigated plagues, repelled empires, and survived modern artillery fire.
Right.
Doesn't catering a massive sector of your tourism industry to a fictional television show fundamentally cheapen the reality of the site? Are we allowing centuries of legitimate, astonishing human achievement to be overwritten by a pop culture fad?
That tension between the preservation of deep historical integrity and the highly lucrative capitalization on pop culture fame is the defining debate among local historians, residents, and thoughtful travelers.
I can imagine.
It is incredibly easy from an academic standpoint to dismiss the Game of Thrones phenomenon as a superficial degradation of the city's dignity. But the author of our source guide reveals a highly sophisticated, deeply pragmatic reality about how these massive cultural phenomena are actually weaponized by the locals on the ground.
Weaponized. He describes the Game of Thrones tours as a highly calibrated Trojan horse, right?
It's a brilliant tactical pivot. Consider the marketing reality for a local historian or guide. If they print flyers advertising a comprehensive 3-hour walking tour detailing the macroeconomic maritime trade tariffs and quarantine protocols of the 15th century Republic of Ragusa.
Yeah, the commercial interest will be virtually non-existent.
The general public simply won't engage with that level of dense historical academia on a summer holiday.
But if you rebrand that exact same walk through the exact same streets as the Game of Thrones King's Landing experience,
you will sell out multiple groups a day, every single day of the season.
That's genius. They use the superficial hook of the fictional universe to pull the demographic through the gates.
Right. They get the crowds engaged with the promise of standing exactly where a fictional king was poisoned. But once that audience is captive and physically moving through the space, the truly elite local guides execute a seamless, fascinating pivot away from the television show and directly into the staggering, verifiable reality of the Republic of Ragusa.
Because the incredible truth is that the historical reality of Ragusa, an independent, sovereign city-state that maintained its liberty here for 5 centuries until Napoleon finally abolished it in 1808, is objectively more dramatic, more sophisticated, and more cutthroat than the political fiction of Westeros.
The guide spends a significant amount of time demanding that we respect this history. So let's completely unpack the mechanisms of Ragusa because it fundamentally changes how you view every stone in the city.
Let's do it. The foundational mechanism of Ragusa was immense, highly liquid wealth, wasn't it?
Oh, massive wealth. At the zenith of its power, this tiny, geographically isolated enclave, carved out of the limestone cliffs, built a merchant fleet that aggressively rivaled the Venetian Empire.
Wow.
The Ragusan argosies, their massive cargo ships, dominated the Mediterranean salt and spice trades, sailing as far as the Americas and the Indian Ocean.
So all that staggering architectural density we've been discussing, the 1,940 meters of fortification, the ornate palaces, the heavy stone paving, none of that exists without the generation of immense capital.
Exactly. But Ragusa wasn't just a brutal accumulation of wealth. The guide highlights how they applied that capital to create incredibly advanced, highly progressive administrative and social systems. For instance, the Republic of Ragusa formally abolished the slave trade in 1416.
Wait, 1416? That early?
Yeah, we need to pause and contextualize that date. 1416 is firmly in the medieval period, pushing into the early Renaissance. It is centuries before the abolitionist movements gained traction in the major powers of Western Europe.
That's incredible.
Ragusa decreed that the commodification of human beings was fundamentally incompatible with their specific, highly valued model of civic liberty. It was a staggering moral and legal advancement for the era.
And their ingenuity extended deeply into the realm of civic engineering and public health, too. The guide points to the lazarettos, situated just outside the Ploce Gate on the eastern approach.
These massive, interconnected stone complexes are a physical testament to a society that understood exactly what its greatest vulnerabilities were.
Because Ragusa was an apex global trading hub, the primary existential threat to their civilization wasn't necessarily an invading Ottoman army, was it?
No, it was the microscopic threat of the bubonic plague and other infectious diseases hitching a ride on their merchant fleets. To protect their economic engine, they had to invent a defense mechanism against an invisible enemy.
So in the 14th century, which was later formalized into the monumental 17th century stone structures we see today, Ragusa implemented some of the most rigorous, scientifically advanced quarantine protocols on Earth.
The physical mechanics of the lazarettos are fascinating. If a fully laden Ragusan argosy arrived from a port in the Levant that was even suspected of harboring an outbreak, that ship was absolutely forbidden from entering the main inner harbor.
It was diverted to the lazarettos outside the walls.
Right. The entire crew, the wealthy merchants, and every single crate of textiles and spices had to be offloaded into these heavily guarded, isolated stone barracks.
And they were mandated to remain sealed within those walls for exactly 40 days. The Italian word for 40, quaranta, is the literal etymological root of our modern word quarantine.
They institutionalized the concept of quarantine. They understood that 40 days was the necessary incubation period to guarantee that a crew was either free of the disease or that the disease had entirely burned its way through the isolated population.
It was a brutal but a highly effective macroeconomic defense strategy. I mean, the global shipping industry knows that Ragusa is the safest, most stringently managed port in the Mediterranean. Your maritime insurance rates plummet, and you successfully outcompete the Venetians.
That intense focus on public health is further evidenced inside the walls. If you navigate off the Stradun and enter the serene cloisters of the Franciscan monastery, you encounter another continuously functioning legacy of Ragusan science.
The pharmacy, established in 1317.
And it isn't a museum recreation, it is an actively operating pharmacy.
That blew my mind. You can walk through the gates of a city that feels like a fantasy movie set, enter a 14th century monastery, and purchase medicinal face creams and herbal lotions that are being actively compounded using recipes formulated before the discovery of the Americas.
It perfectly illustrates the core thesis of those elite guides. Ragusa didn't survive for 500 years in a highly volatile geopolitical vice by sheer luck.
Right, they were sandwiched directly between the aggressive expansion of the Ottoman Empire to the east and the immense naval supremacy of the Venetian Republic to the west.
They survived through unparalleled diplomatic agility. They maintained highly sophisticated spy networks across Europe. They executed brilliant trade treaties, essentially paying heavy financial tribute to the Ottoman sultans to guarantee their terrestrial security, while leveraging their massive merchant fleet to remain indispensable to Catholic Europe.
Their daily existence was a high-stakes, real-world Game of Thrones, played not with dragons and magic, but with trade tariffs, strategic quarantines, and incredibly shrewd geopolitical bribery.
It's just brilliant, and understanding that dense, paranoid, highly intellectual history requires understanding exactly how the city was compartmentalized. The layout wasn't an accident, it was highly intentional.
Which necessitates a deep dive into the map. The guide is exceptionally strong in breaking the modern geography of Dubrovnik down into distinct, highly functional zones.
Where you choose to base yourself fundamentally dictates the rhythm of your entire experience.
Let's visualize the city almost like a living cell. The nucleus is Starigrad, the old town. This is the area entirely encapsulated by the medieval walls.
It is a strictly pedestrianized environment. The arterial core of this zone is the Stradun. Everything of massive historical gravity, the Sponsa Palace, the Rector's Palace, the cathedral, is tightly clustered within a 5-minute walking radius.
But the guide issues a clear caveat regarding the nucleus. Securing accommodation inside the walls offers unmatched immediate immersion, but it extracts a heavy toll.
It is economically the most demanding sector, and in the high season, it is subject to intense acoustic pollution.
The sheer density of late-night bars, the echoing foot traffic on the limestone, and the rattling of early morning commercial delivery carts over the cobblestones can severely compromise the tranquility of your stay.
Which directs our attention outward, across the cell membrane of the walls. To the immediate west, you encounter Pyle.
Pyle functions as the primary receptor for the city. It is the major transport nexus where the regional buses terminate, the heavy concentrations of tours initiate, and the looming mass of Fort Lauvergenac dominates the skyline.
The author pragmatically suggests Pyle as a highly strategic compromise for accommodation. It places you mere footsteps from the western gate, allowing for immediate execution of the dawn offensive strategy, while physically buffering you from the claustrophobic internal crush of the Starigrad at night.
Mirroring Pyle on the eastern flank is Plos. This zone is defined by the lazarettos we discussed, the proximity of Banjay Beach, and a steep, commanding elevation that houses some of the most historic, ultra-luxurious clifftop hotels in the region.
The topography of Plos offers what many consider the defining visual angle of the city, looking backward over the sea at the eastern profile of the walled fortress.
Now, if a traveler's priority shifts away from intense historical immersion and toward a more traditional, expansive coastal resort experience, the map directs them further west.
To the peninsula of Lapad and Babencook.
Right. Lapad represents a completely different urban psychology. It trades the claustrophobic medieval alleys for wide, tree-lined pedestrian promenades, expansive hotel resorts, and a much more relaxed, conventional Dalmatian coastal rhythm.
The trade-off is logistical, though. Accessing the historical core requires a dedicated bus or taxi transfer, entirely removing the spontaneity of just stepping out of your door into the 14th century.
But there is a final, critical geographical zone detailed in the guide, a zone that operates almost entirely independently of the Old Town's romanticism, yet dictates the flow of the entire region's economy.
And the author, leveraging his specific expertise as a cruise specialist, issues his most forceful strategic directive regarding this area.
We are talking about Gruž Harbor. Gruž is the deep-water, heavily industrialized working port, situated a few miles northwest of the historical center.
If the walled Old Town is the grand, pristine main stage, where the elegant performance of history is enacted for the crowds, Gruž Harbor is the gritty, highly functional backstage.
It is where the complex maritime logistics are executed. It houses the daily agricultural markets, the ferry terminals connecting the mainland to the sprawling island archipelagos, and crucially, the massive concrete berths engineered to accommodate the modern cruise leviathans.
The logistics of the Eastern Mediterranean cruise industry revolve heavily around Gruž. Ships navigating itineraries from Venice down through the Aegean Sea to Greece rely on Dubrovnik as a marquee port of call.
And this is where the author launches a devastating critique of the standard operational procedure. He violently argues against the default mechanism of the industry, the half-day port stop.
The standard cruise itinerary drops anchor in Gruž at 8 a.m. Passengers are immediately funneled into a massive fleet of shuttle buses, deposited at the pile gate at the exact apex of the daily crowding.
They're forced to navigate the blistering heat and shoulder-to-shoulder crush of the Stradun for 4 frantic hours, and then are hastily bussed back to the ship for a 4 p.m. departure.
The author's assessment is blunt. If you experience Dubrovnik exclusively through a half-day port stop, you haven't actually experienced Dubrovnik. You have only experienced the physical stress of the tourism industry.
You are not observing the stampede. You are the stampede.
Exactly. His solution is structural. He strongly mandates that travelers engaging with the cruise industry manipulate their itineraries to utilize Dubrovnik not as a mid-voyage stop, but as a terminal hub.
You explicitly book a cruise that either originates or concludes in Gruž, and you forcibly attach a 2 to 3 night pre- or post-cruise extension to the itinerary.
That structural adjustment completely inverts your relationship with the city. By extending your footprint to 3 nights, you unlock the temporal windows that the day trippers are structurally barred from accessing.
You wake up at 6:30 a.m. in a quiet hotel in Pyle. You execute the dawn patrol on the city walls, while the new wave of cruise ships is still slowly maneuvering into the deep-water berths at Gruž.
You kayak the perimeter as the sun sets, and you sit down to a relaxed, deeply atmospheric dinner in the illuminated, echoing alleys at 9 p.m.
It is the architectural equivalent of having a private screening of a masterpiece, compared to trying to glimpse a trailer for it on a crowded subway monitor.
And that transition to the evening rhythm naturally introduces the critical element of gastronomy, because successfully navigating the culinary map requires the exact same level of spatial strategy as avoiding the crowds.
The universal law of European tourist epicenters is magnified intensely in Dubrovnik. Under no circumstances do you dine on the primary thoroughfare.
Right, the restaurants lining the Stradun, aggressively deploying massive, multilingual picture menus, and actively soliciting pedestrians, are optimized entirely for volume and location, not culinary integrity.
You are paying an exorbitant premium to rent a chair on a busy sidewalk.
To access the actual culinary heritage of Dalmatia, you have to physically disappear. You have to navigate away from the center, climbing the steep, narrow, stepped alleys that branch off the main arteries.
The guide highlights several specific establishments that reward that effort. For the absolute pinnacle of high-end dining, he points to Restaurant 360.
360 is a masterclass in utilizing historical infrastructure. The restaurant is physically integrated into the actual ramparts of the medieval walls.
You are consuming Michelin-starred interpretations of Croatian coastal cuisine while elevated above the harbor. The guide notes that securing a table requires booking weeks, if not months, in advance of the high season.
For a deeper dive into authentic, robust regional traditions, the guide directs travelers to Conobbe Domatino, a tavern tucked deep within the internal maze of the Old Town.
Here, the focus is squarely on the foundational pillars of Dalmatian cooking. The author explicitly recommends the black risotto.
Oh, the black risotto, a dense, intensely savory dish heavily utilizing cuttlefish and its ink.
And meats prepared under the pica. The pica is a brilliant example of localized culinary physics. It is a heavy cast iron bell. You place lamb or octopus, along with potatoes and herbs, in a shallow pan, cover it entirely with the iron bell, and then bury the entire apparatus under a mound of glowing hardwood embers.
It functions as a primitive, highly effective slow cooker, roasting and braising the ingredients simultaneously over several hours until the meat completely breaks down.
If the priority is combining high-quality seafood with an unmatched visual aesthetic, the guide highlights Nautica, positioned on the sweeping, elevated terraces immediately adjacent to Fort La Vergenac.
Unobstructed views of the sea crashing against the western defenses.
But the most hyper-specific, fascinating culinary detail in the entire guide revolves around the simplest ingredient, the molly-stain oysters.
Yes. A short journey up the coast from Dubrovnik brings you to the Peljazac Peninsula, a rugged stretch of land that creates a narrow, sheltered channel with the mainland.
The hydrological conditions in the Bay of Molly-Stain are exceptionally unique. You have a constant, dense influx of mineral-rich fresh water from subterranean karst springs, violently mixing with the high salinity of the Adriatic.
That specific brackish water chemistry creates a nutrient-dense microenvironment that produces an oyster with a remarkably clean, metallic, intensely briny flavor profile. It is a true expression of maritime terroir.
The guide directs you to a spot called Bodasser, specifically to consume these immediately after they are pulled from the water.
And you must pair that distinct terroir with the highly localized viticulture of the Dalmatian coast. The guide stresses that Croatian wines, while largely unknown on the global mass market due to low production volumes, are world-class.
It recommends seeking out Divino Wine Bar in the Old Town as an educational hub for indigenous varietals. You are dealing with grapes perfectly adapted to a brutal, sun-baked, rocky maritime environment. Varietals like Plavac Molly, which produces a dense, highly tannic red, and Posip.
But the most intriguing grape mentioned is Gurk. Gurk is a brilliant anomaly of agricultural science. It is a white grape cultivated almost exclusively in small, intensely sandy patches of soil on the neighboring island of Korčula.
The sandy environment is crucial because it inherently protects the vines from phylloxera, the devastating root louse that wiped out most of Europe's vineyards in the 19th century because the insects simply cannot survive in sand.
It's an evolutionary loophole that allows the vines to thrive on their original rootstocks. The resulting wine is fiercely dry, highly acidic, and possesses a subtle pine and sea salt salinity that perfectly cuts through the richness of Adriatic seafood.
It is hyper-regionality at its finest. But amidst all this talk of coastal seafood and island wines, there was one restaurant recommendation in the guide that drastically deviates from the Dalmatian profile.
Ah, Taj Mahal.
Yes. Situated right near the Pile Gate. It is not a Croatian seafood restaurant, nor is it Indian, despite the name. It is a Bosnian restaurant.
They specialize in cevapi, highly seasoned, grilled, minced meat sausages served inside pillowy soman bread and burek, a dense, rich, flaky pastry filled with savory meats or cheeses.
Why is a travel guide dedicated to a Croatian maritime hub explicitly highlighting heavy, meat-centric Bosnian cuisine?
The author provides a brilliant justification, stating that dining there provides useful context, and that seemingly minor culinary aside actually serves as the gateway to the most profound structural paradigm shift in the entire guide.
It forces us to look past the walls of the city and analyze the macrogeography of the region. It reveals Dubrovnik's greatest, yet frequently most underutilized, strategic asset: its borders.
The author issues his final, most sweeping directive. Dubrovnik must be conceptualized not as a terminal destination, but as a regional base camp.
This is where the playbook expands massively. If you execute the logistics, fly to the extreme southern tip of Croatia, and spend 3 entire days walking in circles inside the 1,940 meters of the medieval walls without ever breaching the perimeter, you have fundamentally misunderstood the geopolitical reality of where you are standing.
You have admired the jewel, but you have entirely ignored the complex, fascinating crown in which it is set.
A cursory glance at a map of the Balkan Peninsula reveals Dubrovnik's bizarre geographic isolation. It is an exclave. It is physically severed from the continuous landmass of the rest of Croatia by a tiny 9-kilometer-wide strip of sovereign territory belonging to Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Neum Corridor.
Which, incredibly, is a direct historical legacy of the Republic of Ragusa. Centuries ago, Ragusa intentionally ceded that exact strip of coastal land to the Ottoman Empire, deliberately creating a physical buffer zone so that their territory would not share a direct land border with their greatest rival, the Venetian Republic.
They literally reshaped the map of modern Europe out of medieval mercantile paranoia.
Exactly. Dubrovnik is wedged into a hyper-compressed geopolitical crossroads. It is pinned against the Adriatic to the west, backed immediately into the Dinaric Alps of Bosnia to the north, and borders the dramatic coastline of Montenegro mere miles to the south.
That dense proximity of international borders transforms the city into the ultimate launch pad for some of the most radically diverse day trips available on the European continent.
The guide breaks down 3 specific vectors for exploration that you can access within a 2.5-hour radius.
Let's trace the southern vector first, crossing the border into Montenegro.
A 2-hour drive south completely alters the geological and architectural paradigm. You leave the open, sweeping coastline of the Adriatic and penetrate into the Bay of Kotor.
Topographically, it operates almost identically to a Norwegian fjord, but it is dropped directly into the Mediterranean climate. It is a deeply submerged river canyon, creating a winding, incredibly sheltered inland sea.
The scale of the landscape is oppressive and magnificent. Massive, dark, nearly vertical limestone mountains plunge directly into the dark water, and nestled into the absolute deepest, most protected recess of this geological anomaly is the walled city of Kotor.
Kotor is another UNESCO World Heritage Site, but it offers a massive architectural contrast to Dubrovnik. Where Ragusa fiercely maintained its independence and its unique structural style, Kotor was absorbed into the Venetian Empire for nearly 4 centuries.
The architectural DNA is distinctly Italian Venetian Gothic palaces, asymmetrical piazzas, and a chaotic, organic street plan that lacks the rigid order of the Stradun.
And the fortifications of Kotor don't just encircle the town, they violently defy gravity. The defensive walls literally zigzag hundreds of meters straight up the sheer cliff face behind the city, culminating in a fortress that seems to hang in the clouds.
The guide emphasizes that dropping into the Bay of Kotor provides a dramatic, moody counterpoint that the bright, open coast of Dubrovnik cannot offer.
If the southern vector offers Venetian geology, the northern vector offers a profound cultural and historical rupture. Driving 2.5 hours north takes you up into the mountains, crossing into Bosnia-Herzegovina, and arriving in the city of Mostar.
This is where that Bosnian culinary context comes into sharp focus. Arriving in Mostar is a deep dive into the legacy of the Ottoman Empire.
The architecture shifts from Mediterranean stone to Ottoman timber and overhangs. The skyline is pierced by minarets, and the air smells of copper workshops and strong, unfiltered Bosnian coffee.
Mostar was a critical frontier outpost for the Ottomans, and the physical and emotional center of the city is the starry most, the Old Bridge.
It is an astonishing feat of 16th century Islamic architecture. A single, elegant, incredibly steep stone arch spanning the deep emerald green gorge of the Neretva River.
But engaging with Mostar requires confronting history that is painfully recent. The guide is unflinching about this. The original starry most stood resolute for over 400 years, surviving the collapse of empires and the sweep of world wars.
But in 1993, during the vicious sectarian violence of the Bosnian War, the bridge was systematically targeted and completely destroyed by artillery fire.
The physical destruction of the bridge was a devastating symbolic act, intended to permanently sever the cultural connections within the city. The bridge you walk across today, with local divers throwing themselves 24 meters into the freezing river below, is a massive, meticulous act of post-war reconstruction.
They dredged the original stones from the riverbed and rebuilt the arch using the exact 16th century techniques, joining the blocks with lead dowels instead of modern cement.
The author notes that the juxtaposition of the ancient Ottoman bazaars against the visible remaining bullet holes and mortar scars on the surrounding buildings imbues Mostar with a gravity and a modern relevance that goes far beyond its undeniable photogenic appeal.
Many itineraries also combine this heavy historical immersion with a stop at the Kravica waterfalls, an expansive cascading network of falls in the lush Bosnian interior, providing a necessary mental break.
Having explored the Venetian south and the Ottoman north, the final vector points west, out into the maritime highway of the Adriatic. The guide asserts that a comprehensive Dalmatian experience mandates interacting with the islands.
The most immediate and logistically simple option is navigating the Elefidi archipelago. This is a small, tightly clustered chain of islands situated just northwest of the city. A full-day nautical excursion allows you to interact with the diverse microcultures of the 3 primary inhabited islands.
The guide delineates their distinct personalities. Kolasep is the closest, a heavily forested, deeply quiet island renowned for complex coastal cave systems that you can swim directly into.
Lillpud serves as the middle point. It completely bans car traffic and possesses Sunj Bay, The author specifically highlights Sunj because it is a sweeping, shallow bay of fine sand,
which is a massive geological rarity on a coastline defined almost exclusively by harsh limestone pebbles and jagged rocks.
And the furthest out is Sipan. It is the largest of the three, yet paradoxically the least impacted by heavy tourism.
Sipan is an agricultural retreat, blanketed in ancient olive groves and the decaying, romantic summer manor houses built by the wealthy merchants of the Ragusan Republic to escape the heat of the city.
Sailing between these islands, dropping anchor in a secluded cove to swim off the deck, and eating grilled fish caught that morning is the distillation of the ultimate Adriatic fantasy.
For travelers desiring pure, unadulterated nature over island hopping, the guide pushes slightly further afield to Meljet National Park. Accessible via a 2-hour ferry transit, Meljet is an intensely green, heavily forested island whose defining geographical feature is a pair of interconnected, vibrant saltwater lakes situated in its interior.
It sounds like a fabricated myth. You have an island in the sea containing a lake of salt water, and situated in the exact center of that lake is another tiny islet housing a 12th century Benedictine monastery.
You can rent a bicycle, ride through the dense pine forests, and take a small boat out to explore the monastery in absolute silence.
The sheer volume of these options, Kotor, Mostar, the Elaphitis, Meljet, forces a highly practical logistical question regarding time management.
The overarching consensus of the guide is that 3 days represents the mathematically perfect duration for a Dubrovnik base camp.
Which initially seems counterintuitive. I mean, if you only possess 3 days of vacation capital in the region, doesn't executing a full-day excursion to a different country represent a massive misallocation of resources? Shouldn't you dedicate every available hour to exploring the granular details of the walled city you flew so far to see?
It is a highly logical assumption, but the author's strategic counterargument completely dismantles it. 3 days is the optimal duration, precisely because it facilitates a highly specific, psychologically necessary rhythm of contrast.
Let's break down the mechanics of that 3-day rhythm.
Day 1 is designed for maximum historical and spatial immersion. You take the full impact of the city, you execute the dawn offensive, walking the 1,940 meters of the walls, you navigate the complex alleys of Staragrad, you absorb the dense history of the rector's palace, you process the density of the crowds, you engage with the nucleus.
You essentially take the heavy hit of the city's intensity. Day 2 is about aggressively altering your elevation and perspective.
You rocket up the Mount Shray cable car to comprehend the macrogeography and process the trauma of the 1991 siege. In the afternoon, you perhaps leverage the Game of Thrones Trojan horse to uncover the diplomatic genius of Ragusa.
And you conclude the day by dropping to sea level, kayaking the perimeter as the sun dips below the horizon.
So you have dedicated 2 highly intensive days, strictly to the mechanics and history of Dubrovnik itself. By the conclusion of day 2, your brain has likely mapped every major artery of the old town. You have felt the oppressive friction of the midday crowds.
You have reached a saturation point. You are psychologically primed for a broader horizon.
Which triggers the breakout on day 3. You utilize the base camp. You board a vessel bound for the Elaphitti Islands, or you secure transport across the borders to Mostar or Kotor.
And this is the crucial mechanism. Removing yourself from the city is what actually allows you to understand it. When you witness the heavy Ottoman influence in the architecture of Bosnia, or when you study the distinct Venetian Gothic layouts in Montenegro, the unique, fiercely independent architectural and cultural DNA of the Republic of Ragusa suddenly snaps into brilliant focus.
That is a phenomenal analytical point. You cannot truly appreciate the vibrancy of a color until you place it directly against a contrasting background. By exploring the surrounding empires, you finally understand the geopolitical pressure cooker that Ragusa not only survived, but thrived in.
Exactly. And from a purely physiological standpoint, escaping the compressed footprint of the medieval walls on day 3 provides an essential release valve from the intensity of the crowds.
By expanding your operational footprint, you miraculously transform what could easily devolve into a claustrophobic, high-stress city, break into a sweeping, expansive Balkan expedition. You elevate the entire experience from a simple vacation to a comprehensive geographical study.
Let's pull all of these complex threads together and summarize the core philosophy we have extracted from Iria Voyage's incredible intelligence report. If you are currently plotting an operation to the Adriatic, the playbook is sharply defined and highly unforgiving.
The entire thesis rests on the absolute mastery of timing and spatial context. Dubrovnik is not a passive environment. It is a city that demands a proactive strategy.
If your calendar allows any flexibility, you aim exclusively for the thermal lag of September. If you are forced into the summer theater, you treat the perimeter walls like a strict dawn patrol mission.
You systematically retreat from the friction of the midday heat, and you reclaim the romanticism of the city after sunset. You deploy the pop culture gravity of Game of Thrones as a lever to pry open the staggering 500-year reality of the Ragusan Republic's mercantile and medical genius.
And if your approach vector is maritime, you utilize every logistical option available to convert a highly stressful half-day cruise stop into a multi-night terminal hub extension. You refuse to let your primary memory of this architectural masterpiece be defined by sweating in a bottleneck on the Stradun.
And finally, you leverage the map. You utilize the compressed borders of the exclave to unlock the wider regional complexity, absorbing the fjords of Montenegro and the shattered rebuilt bridges of Bosnia.
Executing those protocols is how you successfully hack the defenses of modern tourism.
Indeed.
As we conclude this deep dive, there is a lingering, highly complex philosophical paradox that the source material continuously brushes against. It's an abstract concept I want to leave you to wrestle with as you process everything we've analyzed today.
It centers on the ultimate existential nature of a perfectly preserved historical site.
Look at the objective reality of modern Dubrovnik. It has fiercely protected and flawlessly maintained its 13th century fortifications. It rigidly outlaws the introduction of modern architecture within its historic nucleus. It continuously polishes its limestone arteries.
And through that fanatical dedication to preservation, it has effectively transformed itself into a pristine, breathtaking stage set designed to process up to 10,000 transient observers every single day.
The inevitable question arises. When a living city executes that transformation, does it cease to be a functional city? Is the modern iteration of Dubrovnik merely a beautifully hollowed-out museum shell, entirely devoid of genuine civic life?
A vast majority of contemporary urban critics and sociologists studying the phenomenon of overtourism would argue an emphatic yes. They would state that the authentic soul of the community has been systematically displaced, sacrificed to optimize the logistics of the cruise industry and the creation of digital content.
But apply the historical lens we just spent the last hour grinding. Analyze the original architects of this environment, the ruling class of the Republic of Ragusa. What were their fundamental overriding motivations?
They were obsessively driven by the accumulation of global wealth.
They were masters of international commerce. They engineered massive cutting-edge infrastructure, from impregnable walls to sophisticated quarantine lazarettos, for one singular overriding purpose: to ensure their port was the most attractive, functional, and secure location on Earth for foreigners to deposit their capital.
They were the ultimate unapologetic capitalists of the medieval Mediterranean.
Exactly. So if we look at it through that specific, highly mercantile historical framework, by drawing millions of global travelers, by meticulously managing and marketing its visual aesthetic, and by completely dominating the regional economy through the constant influx of international wealth, modern Dubrovnik might not represent a tragic betrayal of its historical identity at all.
You could argue it is simply executing its original programming. It is fulfilling its ancient destiny with terrifying modern efficiency.
The primary export commodity merely shifted from salt and spices to historical sightseeing. But the underlying macroeconomic business model of Ragusa is functioning more powerfully today than it ever did in the 15th century.
If you could somehow transport the original merchant lords to the summit of Mount Sra today and show them the armada of mega ships in the harbor and the 10,000 people arriving daily with their wallets open, they wouldn't weep over the loss of a quiet, contemplative city.
No, they would view it as an absolute, staggering triumph of their original vision.
That is a phenomenal paradigm shift. The ultimate merchant republic, 5 centuries later, still aggressively trading on its single greatest asset.
So the next time you find yourself standing there, shoulder to shoulder, trying to admire the delicate brushstrokes of that medieval painting, remember the profound irony of where you are standing.
The massive, chaotic stampede surrounding you isn't ruining the historical reality of the city.
The stampede is the historical reality of the city. It's simply the modern manifestation of a 500-year-old economic engine running at maximum capacity. You just need to ensure you've studied the playbook and set your alarm early enough to secure a front row seat to the performance.
You've been listening to Beyond the Horizon, the podcast by Area Voyages. The full article for this episode is available at www.areavoyages.com. Remember to like, share the podcast, and leave a review to help promote our work. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Until next time, safe travels.